The gospel is a tale of two stories this morning. Jesus starts by warning us of the scribes, those who parade themselves in public, wearing expensive clothes, who like getting recognized in public places for their wealth, power, and status. These people are at the crust of society, who get the best seats in church, parties, social events, etc. These folks that Jesus is describing are the powerful, the leaders, the rulers, and the holy people. Now, Jesus doesn't say there's anything explicitly wrong with these people, okay? It's not inherently wrong to have power. It's hypocrisy. It's abuse. Abusing power is what Jesus warns us of here. Beware of the people who put on appearances of righteousness, but behind closed doors will devour the widows' houses. People who abuse their power to get an upper hand on somebody less fortunate. Of course, right? Of course we get this. Nobody likes the idea of the strong, the rich, the powerful leeching off of the weak, the poor, and the oppressed. This is fundamental to our faith and is found in other stories too. We root for David and revel when Goliath falls, and even in popular culture, the noble knight slays the dragon and rescues the fair princess. We like it when the good guys win and the bad guys lose. However, in real life, that distinction isn't always clear as to who is who. Sometimes we're the good, and sometimes we're the bad. The oppressed or the oppressor, the sinner or the saint. In the readings from today, from Mark and from 1 Kings, a widow is present in all of them. Now, in those days, like in America or Europe of centuries past, and still in some places on earth today, women had little to no rights. They could not own land, property, or wealth of their own. A woman was her father's property, and then upon marriage became her husband's. Upon her husband's death, she was little more than nothing, and would have to rely on begging or prostitution to eke out a living, if those things were even an option to her. Or her and her children die of starvation. The widow in 1 Kings says that exactly to Elijah. She says, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour and a little oil in a jug. And now I'm gathering a couple of sticks so that I may go in and prepare for myself this last meal for me and my son, that we may eat it and die." So when Jesus is making the comparison between the scribes and the widows, he's really emphasizing the massive power difference between those groups of people. So keep that thought in mind now when thinking about the second story from the gospel, the widow's offering. Jesus and his disciples are hanging out in the temple. Jesus is watching the offering box. It's not like today where we have discrete envelopes and online giving. In those days, everybody can see who is donating and how much. The rich people are putting in a lot of money, and the widow gives her 2 pieces of copper. The passage says penny, but the Greek translation for that word refers to about 1/64 of a day's pay for a worker. So these 2 coppers are equivalent to a couple dollars in today's money. Obviously, both then and now, that amount of money doesn't go very far. So this is when Jesus calls over his disciples for a lesson. Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, the poor widow has put in more than all of those who are contributing to the offering box, for they contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she has to live on." So pay attention to that. What does Jesus say here? And what is he not saying? We might like to take this passage and turn it into a moral story on stewardship, to say, look, this widow is far more righteous than the hypocritical, rich, and powerful people. She is good, and they are evil. We should all donate more. Well, maybe we should, but that's not the point, not in this passage anyway. The reality is that Jesus isn't saying anything more than the reality. He's just saying the truth. The widow put in more than the others because of the relative gravity of their situations. He doesn't say this is good. He doesn't say this is bad. He doesn't say we should give in this way or that we shouldn't. Not in this passage anyway. We don't know what Jesus' tone was when he was saying this. I can imagine Jesus feeling conflicted, because I certainly felt conflicted when I was studying these passages and writing this sermon. Maybe he's feeling inspired that this humble person has given so much in a sign of her faith. But the more I read it, and the more I read other theologians' commentaries, it's hard not to feel sad, lost, and hopeless, knowing that this woman has resigned herself to death. Remember that? Jesus mentions that this woman gave all she had to live on. Just like in the story from 1 Kings, when the widow is ready to eat her last meal with her son and die, the widow's offering is her last action on earth before she dies. Maybe Jesus feels solidarity with this woman. This passage from Mark is likely taking place just days before the crucifixion, just days before Jesus is performing his ultimate offering before his own death. But let's look at it this way. What can we control? As in human beings, you and I, in general. What can we control? Very little. We can control how we respond to things, and we can control what we do. This woman, this widow, she can't control the fact that she is considered lesser in her society. She can't change her status. She can't change the fact that she is left with nothing more than 2 coppers. So what does she do? Of course, we don't know anything about this woman other than her status and her offering, but we can still get a lot from that. She could have used those last 2 coins to buy herself another meal or 2, extend her life for a tragically short time. Instead, she quietly and humbly gives that money to the church as a sign of her faith. Last week, we celebrated All Saints' Day, and I'm going to quote Pastor Kim from her sermon last week, because when I was sitting and listening to it, I knew that her words were going to fit perfectly in right here in my sermon. Pastor Kim said, "Death is not the enemy. Sometimes it comes to us as a welcome friend, as a period of relief at the end of a long sentence of suffering. And when that moment comes, we trust our final breath is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter with the Lord in paradise." Now, the widow can't change her situation on earth, but she has faith that heaven is waiting for her in the next life. And really, as death is inevitable for all people, knowing that heaven is waiting for us is about the sweetest thing that I could imagine. So let's come back. Jesus warns us of the scribes, of hypocrisy, of abusing power, and then we get a really intimate look at the consequences of power dynamics used to favor the strong at the expense of the weak. In the story, the widow comes across looking really righteous, and she is. She acts nobly, given some really bleak circumstances. She did the best she could with what she had. And Lord, that's all we can ever ask for, to do the best we can with what we have. In these stories, there are 2 sides, the strong and the weak, a power imbalance. In these stories, these power imbalances are not subtle. Sometimes, though, power imbalance is subtle. In our own lives, we feel it, we see it. It's dynamic, and each of us might find ourselves on both sides of a power dynamic throughout many times in a day. I'm going to give out some examples now. So at work, I might know the most about a project if I've spent the most time on it. On the other hand, I might know the least about a different project, and I would be at a disadvantage and have to ask a lot of questions, right? Simple power dynamic, right? When I'm driving my car, I have a lot of power over pedestrians in the crosswalk, right? But at the same time, thank you for chuckling, that was kind of a joke, thank you. But at the same time, right, if a police officer pulls me over, I have relatively little power. Right now, I'm the one with the microphone, so I've got the power. Hopefully I'm using that power righteously. Thank you again for the little chuckles. Thank you. So the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes we have more power and sometimes we have less. And each of us has a unique background and skills And Jesus is showing us a very clear power difference. So when we have power, we have to, or when we have more influence over a situation than somebody else does, don't use that power to harm them or to make them worse off for it. Don't be hypocritical. Don't be a leech. Don't abuse your power, but instead use it for good. And when we have little power, it doesn't really help anything to worry about it or to complain about it or wallow in the things we can't control. We can, though, always do the best we can with what we have. Every interaction is a power dynamic. We're on different ends of them all the time. The question we should always be asking ourselves is, how can we be the most righteous with what we have? What can we do to make things better for those who have less? Real power is not in our titles, our finances, or our status. Power is in Christ through faith. Jesus is most vulnerable and powerless on the cross, but it's through the cross that he shows us real power, a power that saves and redeems us all. So, we have before us a tale of two stories, rich and poor, powerful and powerless, seen and unseen. The scribes are giving an offering in order to be seen, and the widow is unseen because of her poverty and her status as a widow. In these stories, the ones with power are acting poorly, and the one with no power is acting righteously. Power imbalances are all around us. They're a way of life, a way of nature. As we leave worship later today, pay attention to power imbalances that you experience in your life. How do you use your power? When you have less, are you doing the best you can with what you have? When you have more, what are you doing to make things easier or harder for those who have less? And what kind of story would Jesus tell about you?